as the climax of the creation week, God gave humanity the Sabbath. Welcome to yet another tidbit. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. This particular quarter we are looking at the theme of the covenant. This is the second quarter in 2021. And one question to raise is, does the Sabbath belong to the Old Covenant in the sense that it has been abolished? In order to view that question, you have to look at a timeline. If you are happening to lead out in a Bible study, let me suggest that you draw the line. You put out the mark for creation. You point out a time for the law giving at Mount Sinai. You mark the time of the cross. You may mark the time of the second coming. Where does the Sabbath belong? Now, its origin, just like the origin of the marriage and the family, is in creation. As it belongs to creation order, it makes no sense to say that it doesn't belong to humankind of all ages. Now you may say, but isn't it part of the law at Mount Sinai? Yes. You may remember that so is the law of loving the Lord with all your heart and loving your neighbor as yourself. Those two commandments which Jesus points out are the foundation for the whole law. Of course, when God established his covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai, when he gave them laws, he would not abolish those laws that were universal and which had already been followed. So he integrated into the law at Mount Sinai the specific laws to Israel, also those laws that were universal. Now, as we have looked at the laws given to Israel through Moses, we have realized that from the point of the narrative, from the specific text, the 10 Commandments are unique in relation to all the other commandments. The laws outside of the 10 Commandments were given for Israel in the land that they were going into to possess. And we have that from Deuteronomy 4 verses 13 and 14. So there were laws for the theocracy. As the Christian church was established as a continuation of God's people through the Jewish nation, the theocracy was abolished. And laws which depended on the function of the theocracy did not function anymore. The third part of the law, the ceremonial aspect, all pointed forward to the cross of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus on Calvary, and his subsequent service as our high priest in heaven, in the heavenly sanctuary. These laws, these ceremonies, all had a limited temporary purpose. When the shadow met reality, the shadow had to disappear. But the Sabbath did not belong to the shadow. The Sabbath was established at the time of creation. As we look at the concept of a covenant, let's think about it. How does the Sabbath, in particular, relate to the covenant? We have looked at 3 different aspects of the covenant. First, because the covenant of God is established through God's initiative, it contains, first of all, promises of God. This is, God says, what I will do for you. This is what I will give you in the future. As a second part of the covenant, you have the conditions upon which we are to stay in the covenant, how we are to live in the covenant, God's commandments. And as a third element, you have the confirmation, the ratification of the covenant. That is the sacrifice of Jesus, which made all the promises true. That is, this is what God did in order to secure that his covenant would be eternal. So let's look at the Sabbath. How does the Sabbath relate to these three foundational aspects of the covenant? First, the Sabbath, by pointing back to the original perfect creation, even in the world of sin, point us forward to the day when God will recreate. So in the Sabbath commandment, there is a promise for the future. We celebrate the Sabbath as a foretaste of what is to come. But second, the Sabbath, standing in the middle of the Ten Commandments, not only points us to our relationship to God, but it also opens for our relationship to the world he has created. Notice this unique aspect of the Sabbath. As we have the commandment in, for instance, Exodus, second book of Moses, chapter 20, that I do not keep the Sabbath only for myself. I shall not work, but I am not allowed to let my servant or my animals work. In other words, the Sabbath in itself opens the door for responsibility to the world around me, to other people, to animals, to nature. Look at it this way, as the great Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann would have pointed out many times, that the Sabbath is a no to the materialistic culture we have. Every day I go to work to earn my profit. And profit is high on the agenda for most people in this world. The Sabbath tells me, stop. There's more. The goal is not profit. You're not even allowed to say, I relax, but I exploit my servant. No, this is a day of celebration of the Creator. That's a day where we share, where we stand before God in worship, and every person in that worship is equal in the eyes of God. So the Sabbath not only points to the future promise of recreation, it also shows me that the way of life, which is the condition of staying in the covenant. And then, of course, you have the third element. In a unique way, to me, the Sabbath points to the fact that salvation comes to me from outside, from God alone. This is what the sacrifice of Christ is all about, isn't it? On the Sabbath, I do not do any work, because all the work of salvation is done by God through Jesus Christ. That is the gospel, and that is what the Sabbath points out for me also. Now some would say, well, I have that Sabbath whatever day I choose. But here's another aspect. The Sabbath, the biblical Sabbath, is to be celebrated for that one reason, that God has told us so. Any other day would be human tradition, and because the Sabbath is to be kept as a sign that God alone is the one who sanctifies us, with a reference to Ezekiel 20, verse 12, then it needs to be the Sabbath that God has revealed, not Sabbath with origin in human tradition. Now, at the end then, if that is the case, would not the New Testament reflect that view of the Sabbath? But some would say, but The Sabbath is abolished, isn't it? The law is abolished. Now, first of all, what is abolished in the New Testament is the ceremonial laws that pointed to Christ and the laws for the theocracy, because the theocracy is changed when the remnant in the Christian church is taking over. The Ten Commandments and the Sabbath, they are still there. And we are able to see it. So let me read a couple of texts for you to indicate that. First, in Acts chapter 17, it is interesting that Paul in his missionary journeys is told, in this case, when visiting the city of Thessalonica, it is told that according to his custom, he went into the synagogue where he then spoke with the Jews about Christ for 3 weeks. Now, what is interesting is that that particular expression, according to his custom, exactly the same phrase is used by Luke, the same author of the Gospel as of Acts, in Luke 4:16 about Jesus. So, as Jesus did before the cross, so Paul did after the cross. According to custom, he celebrated the Sabbath. But there are 2 texts more in the book of Acts which are often overlooked, which highlight the Sabbath. They're both found in quotes. The first is in chapter 4. Peter and John, the 2 apostles, have been incarcerated. The church has been praying for them, and now they are released, and they come back to the church believers. And from verse 23, we have a description, the only description actually, of a service, a devotional service in a Christian church. This is the only one we have in the New Testament. It's not the weekly service. Nevertheless, it is there. And we have a prayer. And this is how they pray. When they address God, they say, Sovereign Lord. Acts 4, verse 24. You made the heaven and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In that prayer, they are quoting the Sabbath commandment. Don't tell me they did not know that they were quoting. Don't tell me that they, as they knew they were quoting, did not also keep the Sabbath. Now, but that was only the Jews, you could say. The Christian church was still only consisting of Jews. But let's go to chapter 14. In chapter 14, Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra. That is far beyond everything. They didn't understand what people were saying. They had strange languages. And they were beginning to worship Barnabas and Paul as gods when it dawned upon Paul what they were doing. And in shock, he cried out, and he has a little speech. This is the first speech recorded in Acts, spoken to a non-Jewish audience. And we find it from chapter 14 and onwards in chapter 14 in the Acts of the Apostles. Why are you doing this? Paul says. We too are only humans like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who have made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them. Quoting here the Sabbath commandment. So Paul, in his first sermon recorded to Gentiles, quoted from the 4th commandment, from the Sabbath commandment. Oh, it was still to be kept. But what about, some would say, in Romans 14, Paul, isn't he calling all days the same? Verse 5 in Romans 14, one man considers one day more sacred than another man considers every day alike. Oh yes, but what he is speaking about here is clear from the preceding and from what follows in verse 6. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. He's speaking about days for fasting. There was an ongoing discussion in the Jewish community. Should the fasting take place the 2 days of Tuesday and Friday, or the 2 days of Monday and Wednesday? It has nothing to do with the weekly Sabbath, which celebrates God as Creator. And as we come to the end, in Revelation 14, the first angel of the three that proclaim the last warning to the world is quoting, also like Paul, from the fourth commandment. He said in a loud voice, Revelation 14:7, "Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water." Quoting the fourth commandment in a setting where in the preceding chapter you have had a power that wants us to break the first commandment of having no other God than God, a power that abuses the name of God, that is a breaking of the second of the commandments, a power that sets up an image to be worshipped, that is the third commandment. And here then in the climax you have a quote from the fourth commandment. Yes, the 10 commandments and the Sabbath has the origin in the creation, and they are universally to be kept to the end of the world. Thank you for listening to this tidbit. There's so much more to say about the Sabbath, so I have taken a little more time than I used to. You are welcome back to next week's tidbit.